Hello, my name is Debra Mayfield. I am a first-year PhD student studying U.S. history at Georgetown University. I'm interviewing Dr. Katherine Benton-Cohen, one of our esteemed professors in the history department here at Georgetown. She got her AB in history from Princeton and her master's and PhD from University of Wisconsin-Madison and U.S. women's history. Her expertise is in U.S. women and gender history, as well as immigration and race, and she focuses primarily on the time periods of the Progressive Era and the American West. She is the author of 2 books. The first one published in 2009, Borderline Americans, Racial Divisions in Labor, War in the Arizona Badlands, which talks about how... Borderlands, I'm sorry. Why am I saying Badlands? Maybe
it's
I can't
South
read
Dakota
my own
house.
handwriting. Which
sounded good.
Which talks about the creation of a racial binary system in 19th century borderland where you had much more of a lot of racial diversity, and so how that was created through labor issues. And her second book, which is part of what we read, is the upcoming Inventing the Immigration Problem, the Dillingham Commission and its Legacy. And so that's a brief introduction of Professor Benton-Cohen. And let's go around. What I wanted to ask you is, I read your Wilson Center bio, which was really good. And in it you said that the general questions of your work is who is an American, why, who gets to decide that, and conversely who gets to challenge that determination, and do these determinations over time ever change? And I wanted to know if those questions are the things that led you to write about the Dillingham Commission.
It's a good question. Yes, I think so. There's a lot of ways I can answer that question. I guess I will give a little short answer that I give to some people, that my first book was about immigrants and other people, but a lot of the people on the ground in the area I studied were immigrants from 36 countries. But it was not really about immigration. And I started getting interested in immigration history as a field, as a kind of natural progression out of that. I think immigration history for a long time in the United States was really founded by the first generation of what were then called new immigrants, the big rise of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe in the late 19th century. So the folks who largely Slavs, but the two largest groups being Italians and Eastern European Jews. And they really kind of founded the field of immigration history in the kind of mid-20th century. The first generation of those children of those immigrants to get jobs in the academy. And for many of them, that was a very big deal. So Oscar Hanlon, for example, who was kind of the dean of that, was not the first Jew to get tenure at Harvard, but maybe in the history department. Anyway, I don't want to be quoted on that, but very, were path-breaking in that sense. And they really built immigration history around the paradigm of that generation, which many of us do, inevitably. But it became kind of moribund because that no longer told the story of immigration in the United States in many respects since 1965, in a kind of new generation of scholars, many of them first generation of that post-65 largely Asian and Latino wave, what we're kind of stuck calling the new immigrants, were really reviving the field, and it was becoming very vibrant. And so as a field, it was exciting. The work of May Nye was coming out, who has literally sort of single-handedly transformed the field of immigration history. So a long way of saying that in my first book, I noticed this move to define Mexicans on the border, Mexican Americans, as non-white, but they were legally white. So there was this sort of move from talking about whiteness to Americanness that also allowed policymakers and corporate mining employees to kind of skim over racial questions about Italians and Slavs, right? Were they white? And they were legally white, but if you talked about becoming American, you could talk about citizenship and things like that. So that kind of became a bridge to the second book, which is very much about immigration policy. And to be completely frank, and as you think about PhD projects, this was for a second book, but I had a few ideas for a second book project. And that was near the top of the list. But quite honestly, I interviewed for a job at Georgetown, and I had a 2-year-old at the time. And I needed a project that was doable where I lived. A federal policy project was ideal for living in Washington, D.C. And when I was at my interview here and I was at lunch at the faculty club, John McNeil asked me what my next project was going to be. And I said, well, I've got a few in mind. Here's one of them. And he said, that one looks great. You should do that one. And I thought, well, I would like a job here and I wanted to be happy. So yes, okay, I'll do that one. So I want you to realize that passion and practicality need to blend in terms of choosing projects.
All right. Passion and practicality. So your passion has been, like, it's gender. But you did talk about how, when we had our pre-interview, that every time you would start writing about, not every time, but the last couple times you started writing about gender, race and other categories started coming in, and that they were not just intersecting, they were interconnected. They were inexorably together. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so of course, in retrospect, I was obviously talking about what everyone calls intersectionality, and it seems like a no-brainer now. But in some ways, I'm glad that I didn't have that language, because that has become, not that it's actually one of the more descriptive buzzwords, I think a very effective one, but I didn't actually even have any jargon to describe what I was doing, which made me really struggle to find an accessible way to talk about the ways that people experience their identities. And let me just say, in the case of both my books, sad to say, in some respects, they're less about identity than they are about categories that other people impose on people, right? So, as you probably know, and you read Foucault today, it's very difficult, and Canaday, it's very difficult to suss out, particularly 19th century and earlier sources, what somebody's identity is. But it's somewhat easier to suss out how other people categorize them. Perhaps less satisfactory, but nonetheless easier to come across. And what I found, as I was explaining to Debra in our chat before, is that I had this idea of my dissertation, which is about southeastern Arizona. I had chosen it because I wanted to do something equally about the American West and equally about women's history. It had a foot in both, soundly in both camps at University of Wisconsin. And I had this idea that I was going to write about something that was popular in the 1990s, which was intercultural relations, how women of different ethnic or racial backgrounds interacted with each other. But it sounds cliched, but honestly, the sources took me in a different direction. What I found was this very fluid language about how those racial or ethnic lines were being constructed. And I think the reason why I love being a historian is that I'm very interested in those theoretical ideas, but I like that you can see them very grounded in the evidence. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that I suggested to Professor Sand that you read the Canaday work, because I think that she does an extraordinary job. This is my humble opinion. And in her book, you notice she wrote that while she was still a graduate student, no pressure. In her book, she really demonstrates how she brings theory to the archive, but the archive, she uses really hard evidence, literally out of the National Archives, to prove her points. And I did find actual stuff I came across was company mining officials or newspaper writers sort of arguing about what racial category people were in, or seeing on the ground really different set of race relations in rural and urban areas that had different kinds of economic sectors and trajectories. And so I also saw that those were deeply bound up in ideas about masculinity and femininity and about family formation, and I really wanted to talk about all those things simultaneously.
So today our class is about identity categories, obviously. And one thing that I thought was really interesting is you pointed out at the beginning of Gentleman's Agreement that when Jinx decided to compile everything and publish it, or not Jinx decided, but when everything was compiled and published, that he called it the immigration problem, a study of immigration conditions and needs. And you said the fact that he called it a problem was interesting, because when did immigration become a problem? They decided it was a problem. So that kind of leads to, when people categorize you and they put labels on you, does that kind of automatically connote in your idea that they have then become a problem or marginalized in a way?
Oh, I see. I don't think necessarily having a category itself makes you a problem. I mean, you could have the category of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite in it.
Yeah.
I mean, it might pose some existential problems, but they're not ones that I have a ton of, time for. So, No. But I think, well, that's a really interesting question. I don't know. It could kind of go in two directions. The question is, do you get put into categories and then the categories become problems, or is it the case that the policymakers see a problem and they're anxious to categorize to solve it? I think probably the latter.
Yeah, I was thinking kind of like Foucault, and when you're categorized as a psychopathic, or you're categorized as a hysterical woman. Those are kind of words that are repressive. So is that kind of a form of repression? Did you get a chance to read Foucault? You probably don't.
I mean, I was skimming it this morning. It's been a long time, but no, I didn't then.
But I just thought yes, what stood out to me. And that goes to the power relations too, which might not be the state, but even if it is the state, is not the state, kind of people forcing these categories onto you. You're not really, and when you're a white Anglo-Saxon male, you've created that category for yourself in a sense, and then people accept that.
It's true, although you're not aware of it. So I mean, I don't want to get too involved in 21st century identity politics, but I actually do think like the question of privilege is relevant here, and that I want to actually, these are sensitive times, but I'm going to put some sympathy on like the challenge of white privilege is how many people don't feel it, right? It's totally naturalized, so it really is genuine when people don't feel their white privilege because they don't necessarily see it in their lives because it, you know what I mean? Because it's been made invisible by other categories because it's the norm. And obviously, I think that was the case with some of these policymakers. With respect to the category question, and this is, everybody who does this kind of work is implicitly or explicitly influenced by Foucault. There is and I think a lot about like James Scott seeing like a state, there's a way in which a bureaucrat has to have legible categories. So many of you, because we're a very international and global department, are either immigrants yourselves, visitors, or have traveled extensively abroad. And I always tell my undergrads when I teach immigration history, I mean, I do the most innocuous border crossing you can imagine every summer because I have a house in Nova Scotia. I look like this, and I'm going to Canada in a part that looks like this. So that is like the lowest bar. There's still, and you all know this, that frisson of anxiety of show your papers, right? Even for the most innocuous, probably unproblematic crossing, you know that USCIS agent has a lot of individual power. At the same time, whatever it is their desire to do right or wrong, right? I mean, there's a wide variety. Let's assume that they really, most of them are really, diligent about doing their jobs and not trying to screw anybody. They still have to fit you into a category. I mean, that is the nature of bureaucracy. And so, what you see in Canada, right, of course, is her talking about the struggle to create legible identities or categories for the state.
Speaking of Canada, and then I'm going to open up to everybody, what I thought was really interesting, and Canada pointed it out, is with the conduct versus the status model, most especially with the status model, race and sex come into their determination. So she had in the article two Latino men, I think they were both from Cuba, who they weren't deviants. I mean, they did some disorderly conduct behavior, but they were automatically categorized as homosexual. Whereas, and the woman who was a woman who had a sexual relationship with another woman, admitted at least, she was automatically categorized as homosexual. However, the white Canadians, they had some wiggle room.
Yeah.
So they were nice guys, they worked really hard, someone took care of their mom. We don't know if the Cubans were nice guys and worked really hard, took care of their mom. It didn't matter, because they were homosexuals. So their conduct their status was influenced by the external categories as well. So
categories that, by the way, didn't match their own cultural norms.
Exactly.
That those were not the same categories as their home countries might have had.
Kind of going back to your work, I mean, how would you talked about how the Japanese were seen as not as Mongolian as other Asian cultures, which I thought that was so interesting. And, even, I don't remember how to pronounce his name, I don't know, Ichihashi or Ichihashi, talked about how the Japanese are actually just really Greek and Spanish, actually. Not really, but they look like it. So you have this kind of normalization of them based on ideas of race. So can you talk about that a little bit, kind of connecting?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Professor Sand actually knows a lot more about that than I do, but I think part of the realization there that's uncomfortable is that, right, the Japanese had their own ideas about racial hierarchy that served their own imperial needs. And when I say served, again, and I'm grading all the papers for my History 099, which is Becoming American, Episodes in American Citizenship, so we're kind of dealing with these same issues, but on a more elementary level, they all impute this sort of like deviousness, like this purposeful deceit in the writers that they're analyzing. They're doing primary source analysis. I'm like, people believe their own shit, people. Like, this is not, it's not one or the other. Like, everybody is not an evil genius. Like, they're drinking their own Kool-Aid. You know, this is, and I think that's actually a really important piece of historical analysis, is that on the one hand, we need to be suspicious, but on the other hand, you know, and the AHA actually says, like, we're supposed to have empathy. That's one of the historians' central tenets. And I do think it's important is, like, at first, just like I think you should with anybody you meet on the street, you should take them at their word and try to see where they're coming from. And so when I said it serves the Japanese, you know, imperial desires, that's true, but they also believe, right, that's a feedback loop. So part of this is coming out of, right, elite geopolitics that, as I write about, the State Department, missionaries, Roosevelt and Root, they all are negotiating on a global level with this, in our terms now, rising rival superpower, right? And that both behooves them to take these folks seriously and to find a kind of, again, to use this word, legible, comparable racial hierarchy, right? It undermines a lot of other things in the United States, like the Chinese Exclusion Act. If you say that the Japanese are the same as the Chinese, it's really problematic when you've sided with them in the Russo-Japanese War, for example, right? So there's some, again, it's both strategic and probably genuine beliefs happening there.